I think we're live.
All right.
Alrighty. Hey there, everybody, and thank you so much for coming if you're here to our live discussion of VITA
All right.
Nostra. Alrighty. Oh, hey there, everybody, and thank you. Sorry, it was. There we go. Okay. Thank you for coming to our discussion of VITA Nostra. Here's the book. This is written by Maryna and Serhiy Dyachenko, and it was translated by a dear friend of them called Julia Meitov Hersey. And we are really excited to discuss this book with you. Really briefly, we are actually going to start off with non-spoilers. So if you haven't read this book and just want to hear just general thoughts and see if it's something that might interest you to pick up, we can definitely go ahead and do that. And then I will actually put up a banner when we do start to discuss spoilers, just to let you know, and you won't know anything. But with that, I did want to go ahead and let our lovely co-host introduce herself and tell us a little bit more about the summary of the book.
Sure. So, hi, everyone. My name is Johanna from the channel Johanna. And Vita Nostra is a story about a young girl named Sasha. And she and her mother are on vacation at the beach. It's like, I think, a summer vacation. She's she's a teenage girl. We think she might be around 15 when the book starts. And while on vacation, she's encountered by a strange man who keeps appearing everywhere she is. And it seems as though her mother doesn't even really notice this man or doesn't even care or doesn't seem to think he's a problem or a threat. But Sasha feels very uncomfortable. And eventually she ends up having to interact with this man who ends up having her do these very strange tasks. Now, when she tries to get away from doing these strange tasks, a very strange thing occurs in which she keeps on wishing it were just a dream and then waking up, but then only to have things kind of happen over again, in which she has to interact with this man no matter what. So she's basically coerced into a situation where she has to follow his instructions. So, like I said, he has her perform some very weird, strange tasks. And eventually, she is invited into this Institute of Special Technologies. And so that's where actually the bulk of the story takes place, is in the Institute of Special Technologies. It is in a strange town, and so it's very much like a dark academia setting type of story. And I know that sounds, I think that just about summarizes it. Is there anything else you wanted to add to what I said, Tunisia?
No, I think you did an excellent job summarizing the plot. And I guess the only other thing, not entirely related to the plot, that I would like to add is that it has so many different elements within this book. It sort of even there's no real categorization that I would put it in. Going into it, I thought it was strictly fantasy. I thought it was going to be like a high fantasy tale with some elements of dark academia. But as I started to make myself through it, I started to question, is it more of a horror book? Is it magical realism? Is it science fiction? It just defies classification. So it's definitely a book for people who love books that transcend different genres.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. I think for me, I really loved the academic setting. I know that I did watch a couple of reviews this morning in preparation for this just to hear what other people have said. And I heard from other reviewers, not that they were making this comparison, but that they had heard it had been compared to the show, I guess, the book, The Magicians, as well as Harry Potter.
Yeah.
And this obviously has a very different type of story, a different type of setting, even though it is very much like a dark academic setting. So I definitely think that this could appeal to people who like that type of story. But like you said, it does have a blend of magical realism on the spectrum of fantasy. I would say this is more magical realism in a way, though
Yeah.
it does seem to take place in a completely fictional setting. So yeah, I think it has a little bit of something for everyone though, because it does have that element, but it also has like an element of suspense. You're very close in, it's not told in first person, but you are following very closely the character of Sasha. And so it has interesting character work. And it just really leads you in a direction you do not expect. This is very highly conceptual. So curious to hear it. I want to hear actually, did you like the book? Personal impressions?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. And let me just show this comment. Hi, Ben. Thank you for joining us. And thank you to the other 4 people that are watching. If you want to say hi, introduce yourselves, that would be lovely. So I did end up really, really liking it. It was more of a 4-star read for me, 4 to 4.5-star read for me. And the only reason for that is because there are some of the, I guess, knowledge or plots or just information that is given can be very esoteric and vague. And even though I deeply enjoy those kinds of books where you slowly start to peel back the layers and things are revealed, and I think this book did an excellent job. Some of, and without giving spoilers, I'll try to be also very vague. Some of the concepts just went over my head, and I constantly had to put the book down and do a little bit of research on the side for me to even understand what the book was trying to tell me. And because of that, my enjoyment level went a little bit down, which is why I gave it a 4 stars. But I can definitely see myself loving this book on a reread because it's one of those books that, depending on what stage of your life you're at, you're going to find some things in it. And then when you reread it and learn a little bit more, then you're going to find other things in it. So those were my overall non-spoilery thoughts. What about you?
Yeah, that's a real, by the way, you brought up the word esoteric, and I thought that's a really good word to describe this book. It's esoteric, it's enigmatic, it's complex, and at the same time, it's very readable. So I found myself incredibly fascinated by this journey of this character, Sasha, and what she's going through. And it's interesting because I would say the majority of my reading experience was sort of a blend of sort of a little bit of suspense and intrigue at the same time as I was invested in finding out how, and just seeing her character sort of shift over time. So you watch this character go through some major changes throughout the story, and also just watching the way she interacts with people either in the institution as well as with her mother. So that's also a really interesting dynamic as well. So there were a lot of things there. It's obviously a bit of a coming of age story as well. Now, as far as like my overall personal enjoyment of this book, I will let you know that I was completely gripped while I was reading it. I was loving my reading experience, just not wanting to put it down, just finding some of the themes interesting. I could tell that they were planting seeds for something very interesting and weird to develop, because there is a very interesting weird element here when she gets to the institute. And I think I could say this spoiler free. You start to see that things are very odd there. Very, very odd. I mean, things are already odd with the strange man who encounters her at the beginning and the tasks he has her do. But there are a lot of like red flags that something isn't quite right, even when she arrives at the institute. And so just watching all of that happen on the page was an interesting journey. But I'll be really honest and say that, without giving away any spoilers, one thing that I'll say about the ending is that it fits the story, I think, incredibly well. When I got to the end, I thought, yeah, that's weird. I couldn't have seen that coming. And at the same time, it works with the story. It makes sense. And at the same time, I'll be honest with you, I felt a little detached at the end with the way it went. I don't know why. But we can get into that maybe in spoilers. But I just, I was hoping to have the ending hit me a little bit more emotionally than it did, but I still appreciated it. And I thought it was still an incredible journey. And it's definitely a book that I think lends itself to rereading, because I know even just kind of scanning over some of my highlights, and because I read it on ebook and I highlighted a bunch of passages, even just going back over that, you can definitely see that there are some very interesting passages that foreshadow some things that happen towards the end. So I think it definitely has some reread value. And I think, is it going to, I mean, the second book, Isn't there a sequel? Is there a sequel? You know?
Yeah, it's actually part of a larger series called the Metamorphosis Cycle. And I tried to find more context around it because this is, and this is valuable to know for people who haven't read it. This is the first book that's been translated into English from Russian. And potentially the other books will be translated, but we don't really have a set date. And so from the little digging that I did, it sounds like the books are tied together through concepts rather than plot. So we might not necessarily see these same characters in the next book. But if someone who has read these books in Russian and you're here, or later on if you're rewatching the live, and you have any insights into that, please let me know or let us know, because I would be so interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. And I don't remember where I heard this before about this book, but I heard somebody say something about how it has allusions. It has a lot of literary allusions. And one of the literary allusions was to Kafka's The Metamorphosis, which I thought it just makes so much sense. And I've never read I'll be honest, I know that was like supposed to be required reading in high school, and I never was required to read it for some reason. I don't know how. I need to read it. But I do know about the Metamorphosis for the most part. I did watch like a analysis on that recently. I'm like, that really kind of makes sense. Sort of like the isolated experience and transformation that this character is kind of going through. And I thought maybe there was and maybe possibly like a Plato's cave allegory allusion as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's some interesting allusions in this book as well.
So many different things that they explore in this. I read Metamorphosis, I think it was the first time I read it in my adulthood. It was maybe 3 years ago now, 2 years ago. And the similarities are there. It's interesting in that one because the transformations happen while he's with his family, and in this, you're in an institution. But that's all I'll say because we are still in the non-spoilery thoughts. I do agree with you in the ending. Not that I felt necessarily detached, but that I think it's a very, in my opinion at least, it's a very open-ended ending, and I'm very intrigued and excited to discuss it with you because I think it could be interpreted in so many different ways depending on what you were focusing on when reading the book or what you were getting from it. So before we get into spoilers, who would you recommend this book to?
I would recommend this book to anyone who likes dark academia. And by the way, Fraser, I watched your review. Now that I'm so glad that you're here. By the way, Fraser Simons, I found your review thanks to Travel Through Stories. And so I actually looked that up this morning, and I liked your video. I didn't have time to comment, but fantastic analysis in that video. That was the best analysis I've seen actually on the video analysis I have found on VITA Nostra so far. So definitely check out that review. Since he's here in the chat, maybe he can chime in with some thoughts on sort of the themes and meanings later on in the spoiler section when we talk about spoilers, because I had some really interesting thoughts on that. What was I going to say? What was the question again? I'm sorry. Oh, who I would recommend this to.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So I would recommend this book to a variety of readers, honestly, because I think even if you're somebody who is not a fantasy reader, I think you could still enjoy this. People who like, even people who just are interested in intriguing books that are rich again with literary allusions, with making you think more deeply about sort of conventions, I think, and even if you are into fantasy or dark academia or coming of age stories, it could appeal to that type of reader as well. So I think that's kind of the interesting thing about the book, is it really can appeal to a wide variety of readers.
I definitely agree. With that being said, I don't think this book is going to be for everyone, just because of the way the story unfolds and the themes that it focuses on and the way that it is told. It's has this very non-Western way that the plot that it's structured in. It's there's no chapters, and I think that's the first thing that caught me off guard when I was reading it. Is I usually read a couple of chapters and put a book down, and I like to read in like strides, not consume a book in one sitting. And I was just reading and reading, and there wasn't an end to the first chapter, and I kept thinking, wow, this is a very long chapter. So then I peeked and I was like, oh, it's divided into parts. So it is divided into 3 separate parts, and it's approximately 400 pages. And it also doesn't follow those like rising tensions and falling tensions that you would in a regular Western novel. So I think it structures very different from traditional books. So that is something to keep in mind. And I also think that people who read Russian literature, or if you like books, it is a dark academia fantasy horror type of book, but it also does, I think, an incredible job of talking about mundane things. Like a lot of the time we're spending time with Sasha and her mom, but we're also following her through university as she's studying, as she's learning things. And I feel like that emphasis on the mundane was done really, really well, to the point where you read it, but it's not boring. It's still intriguing. There's still some tension. So,
That's a really good description. I totally agree with you about that. I think that's something, I don't know. Have you ever read Ninth House by Lee Bardugo?
I haven't. It's on my TBR.
I really enjoyed it. That book is very divisive, though, because it's about these sort of mysterious cults at Yale University, and it's very paranormal. It's a very different type of story. It's a very, very different type of story. But it was marketed as dark academia for good reason. But at the same time, I saw people who were very disappointed in the book because although it takes place at Yale, the person you don't really get much out of the academic life atmosphere. You know what I mean? You're not really spending a lot of time in the classes or seeing the interactions between students and professors. Whereas this you do. I mean, there's a surreal element that kind of comes in and out at the same time as what you mentioned. There's like this juxtaposition with the mundane and the ordinary life and the people partying and blaring loud music and having food and smoking cigarettes and that kind of thing too. So I think that it did a really good job with that as well, and I love that. I actually really love. I don't know what it is. I love fantasy that blends in a little bit of the mundane life because it grounds the story. So I felt like it really grounded the story very well. Like you felt like Sasha was a very relatable, understandable character.
Yes, definitely agree. You put it into better words than I did. It really grounds the story. Okay, so is there anything else that you want to talk about or discuss in non-spoilery terms before we move on to spoilers?
Let me think. I mean, I guess I would just agree with you that I definitely agree that while this appeals to a wide variety of readers, it will not be for everyone. I think if you are someone who doesn't like, you know what I thought of when I read this book a little bit, although I felt like my reading experience was very different in a way. I did think a lot of Piranesi by Susanna Clark. In some ways, it's very different, but I still feel like people who wouldn't like Piranesi would not like this book. Then again, Ola Wild Witch she DNF Piranesi, and this was her favorite book of last year. But so maybe that's a bad example. But I do think they kind of remind me of similar types of reading tastes for some reason.
No, I agree. Piranesi is a lot shorter than this one. But yes, I agree in that the way that the information is presented and that you're thrown into a scenario where you really only know as much as our main character, and even information is being withheld from our main character. So there's a lot of uncertainty through a large percentage of this book. And if you are someone who wants things divulged right off the bat, or you're someone who wants to figure it out, but you do have crumbs that are being left, but it's not enough. But we do have one question. How was the pacing overall?
Oh, yeah.
That's a really excellent question. I would say that the pacing is on the slower side. It's a slow to medium paced book, but the authors still do a wonderful job of creating tension with the mundane. Without going into spoilers, this is a very bizarre type of school, and there's consequences for not achieving academic success per se. And so they're constantly being put on the precipice of failing and what that entails within this school. And it keeps you on your toes. But overall, the pacing, I would say, is more slow to medium paced, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm really the worst person when it comes to assessing pacing because my instinct is to want to say, "Oh, it's amazing." I just was turning the page constantly, but every time I say that, people are like, "It was a slow-paced book." I'm like, "Oh, I don't know. I just like slow books." So I have I have no accuracy when it comes to that. But,
Embrace it.
yeah, no accuracy when it comes to that. Sorry, or no reliability, I should say. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm comparing pacing to, I would say, like a thriller, something that is where the plot moves very, very fast. In this one, for context, at the beginning of the book, Sasha's around 15 or 16. She's just ending high school. When we hit the end of the book, she's around 19 and she's ending her university studies. So that's the span that it covers. So we do cover a lot. We cover 3 years of her university, and we do get pretty in depth with the studies and her everyday life. So just for context.
Yeah.
Yes, love how you had to figure things out along with her, solving the puzzle alongside. I agree.
Yeah.
I love that too.
It did feel that way, like very much like putting a puzzle together.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so with that, this is your warning. We will be talking about spoilers from here on out. So if you do not want to be spoiled, if you haven't read it, press pause. And if you end up reading it, you can come back and watch the rest of the live. But with that, we're jumping into spoilers.
Yay.
Okay, so what do you want to talk about first?
Oh my goodness. What do I want to talk about first? Oh man, I should have come up with a list of questions because there were some questions that I had. But I guess I guess I just have questions really. So as far as okay, there was a scene in which is it Farid ends up giving her the choice whether she can get out of kind of like a get out of jail card. Like you can wake up, this could all be just a dream, or you can reverberate as a word or whatever. So she turns out, as we learn in this story, she is a verb. Well, first you think she's a verb anyway, towards the end. Then that changes. In the, now I forgot the type of verb, but she's a verb. So anyway, I guess the question is, when he gave her the choice, one question that came to my mind is I'm trying to understand his role in things. And in Fraser's wonderful review, he talked about Farid, I believe, maybe that was the advisor, a different person, being the role of fear.
Yeah.
And so I guess I was just curious because there was also passages earlier in the story about projections and a lot of questions about, what do you see? Oh, I don't see anything. Oh, I see a projection or, reflection, things like that. Like, oh, projections, this is interesting. And that was what was making me think of the Plato cave analogy. But I guess one thing I asked is like, what was the deal with and maybe I know this might not be the most hard magic sort of story or anything, but I guess I was just wondering, how is it that he's able to have control over that? Like, is this all his doing? Is this all his dream or his projection? Is Sasha part of his projection and he can allow her to wake up because it's him running the show? But then at the end, it didn't seem like he was running the show. So I guess that's where I got confused.
I did see Fraser's review, and I watched part of it. I didn't go into the spoiler section, so I haven't fully watched it. I didn't want to be influenced by other people's
Fair enough. Yeah.
So
maybe I shouldn't, Fraser, I'm sorry, because I totally brought up some of your ideas, and I totally wouldn't have seen them. I thought they were really interesting, though. Yeah.
So my initial thoughts, and I finished the book this morning, but I sort of saw, wow, why am I forgetting his name? Fareed, that was his name, as death per se, because he's using, and I think there was a point in time where she was like, oh, why, if you would have encouraged me in a different way rather than instilling fear in me, you gave me fear. And he was like, no, I redirected your fear. So in a way I saw him as fear, but I also saw him as death, as this character that controls death. And then I saw Sasha with the references of her projecting love and with her, innocence. And I saw her as the embodiment of life. And so I thought, especially at the end, where I think the end is still a little bit hazy for me. I'm not entirely sure what happened, if she passed the test or not. But in that final scene, she comes back home and she heals her little brother because he no longer has a fever. So in a way, I see them as juxtapositions in the same playing field. She's life and he's death. And I think that's why he gave her that option to forget everything, because in this current state, he existed. And if she were to reverberate and create her own life, maybe he wouldn't have existed any longer. Or maybe he would have, because he instilled fear in her. There's so many questions surrounding that, and that's just my initial take.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's really interesting. Oh man, I had a really good quote up here that I wanted to get to.
No problem. That's what the video is there
for. I do have highlighted. It says, and this is towards the end of the book, it says here, and I'm sorry, I'm reading this a little out of context, but it says here, unlike words, people actually die, but Farid is not a word. He's a rule, a grammatical rule. When his external shell, becomes old and dies, I will become him. Okay, so that's what Kostya is saying.
Yeah.
So that's also a part of the story too, is the idea that he will become his father when his father dies, but he's a rule, a grammatical rule. That's so interesting.
And Sasha's the password, right? So in a way they interact, but they're not opposites, I guess. The entire time while I was reading it, I wish I knew a lot more about computer programming, but that's what I thought about. Someone creating, I don't even know what the term is, but like when you create a website and there's all the language in the back, that's what I kept thinking about the entire time when you create something. So I guess maybe in terms of computer programming, if he's the rule, he's all of that text, and Sasha is the password to get into the website.
There was something about hypertext, wasn't there too?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's exactly how I was picturing it too. I'm like, okay, this is like a computer and this is like code or something. He's like a whole bunch of like code words and things. But it's interesting because the students at the school, each one of them has a role in this too. Each have a word. And then the fact that she was a password. So there's another theme I feel like that underlies this book that was interesting, and that's willpower. And I was curious about how they are defining willpower in the book, because on the one hand, I could see how willpower plays a role here, because it's not necessarily out of her free will, but Sasha is kind of coerced into doing these tasks for an exhaustive amount of time, committing things to memory, reading these books and trying to take in all this information, studying and studying and studying and studying. And so she exerts herself. So in one regard, I can see how that is a matter of willpower, because willpower is actually a real thing. It's actually something that we can utilize with the energy of our prefrontal cortex, and But we're limited. Each human being is limited as far as how much willpower we can exert. It actually costs calories to use willpower after a certain point. It costs brain power. It costs energy. So I could see how she definitely pushed the limits of her willpower due to what she felt like she had to do. And then at a certain point, it was like there was a switch in her. And I thought that was really interesting. So at first, it was like a matter of effort and will, which I would call willpower. And then at a certain point, it's like you do something over and over and over and over again that it becomes so habitual, and then it becomes compulsive and obsessive. And that was what happened to her. She just suddenly became obsessed, and she had to know more, and she couldn't stop herself. She couldn't stop herself. And they got mad at her for that. They said, "Why, you're not controlling yourself? You're out of control." She's like, "But I'm trying. And her willpower was not working in her favor when she was trying anymore, because it was running her. So she couldn't, like, she was trying. So I don't know about her having the strongest willpower. I think she was out of control at a certain point. And then the other part too, they kept on telling her, the problem is when she was trying at another point, they were trying to get her to understand certain sort of concepts or whatever they were trying to teach her. And she would say, she was also like fighting, saying, "I'm trying to learn this. I'm working so hard. I'm reading all night." And they're like, "Your willpower is too strong." I'm like, well, her willpower is what's it. And I think what they mean, I kind of got the impression that when they said willpower in that context, they meant something different. They meant her boundaries are too strong, because sorry, I'm running into it. I'm going to let you respond to what I said so far, because I'll keep going. I have more thoughts.
That's so interesting. I want to come back to willpower because I thought about it in a different context as well. But question right back to you. So do you think that ultimately when Farit gave Sasha an out, did she ultimately have a choice? Since we are talking about willpower and free will, right? And it's interesting that you say that she didn't have the willpower. I thought she did, but it was being directed somewhere else. She was directing that subconsciously, maybe, to not. And as much as she was at the university and wanted to continue learning, she was being held back by the love she had for Katya, the love she had for her mom, for her brother. So I thought it was just directed to a different area. So she, even as much as she wanted to learn and continue, and she wanted to continue to thrive with that curiosity, she was being held back because she still was human and she still was attached to her earthly desires. And so I just felt like it was a misdirection. But did you think it was a choice at the end of the day? Like, if she had said, this is a dream and I want to wake up, would they have let her? Was it ultimately, or was it an illusion of free will and of choice?
Oh, that's such a good question. I love that question, because I don't know that we know the answer to it. And at the same time, like, it's interesting that you brought all that up, because I think that speaks to, like, when I'm using the words, I'm sorry, I need to keep up with comments here. I'm still in what the hell.
Yeah.
Same here, and I finished it a few weeks ago. So, yeah. So basically, the way that I interpreted this is, it almost felt kind of like, almost like conditioning or grooming in a way. Like, because when she starts off, what is she motivated by? The stakes are super high. She's motivated by her fear, and her fear is what's going to happen to her mother. And then, so it's like she has to do everything in her power to do whatever they want at the school to protect her mother. And so it's not like she wants to do any of this. She sort of feels kind of like, I have to. And so she does exert free will. I mean, she does exert her willpower to do what she needs to do, to work as hard as she needs to work. And after a while, it takes over her identity. So in the spoiler-free section, we were talking about Piranesi. And again, I think that this also, without giving away spoilers for Piranesi, I think that this is a really fascinating exploration on identity too, because she's obviously, she learns what she is at the end of the book, which is unlike any of us realize, and she's transforming, her identity's transforming as she's going through the school. But what's interesting is, while she's like putting her time and effort and energy into learning all this stuff, she doesn't get it. It looks like kind of jargon. Probably, I bet you anything when rereading this book, a lot of this stuff will become more clear. So it's kind of like that as a first timer. You're like, what am I reading? And then the second time, whoa, I get it. So we might have a Sasha experience with that, because eventually it goes from her subconscious mind. I got the impression that all of this information they're feeding her kind of is just going in, but it's going into her subconscious mind. So she is taking it in. She's not quite fully understanding it yet. And then after a while, it switches and she starts to get it and she starts to understand. And at that point, I think she does have more agency, perhaps. And so maybe it is her choice at the end. But at the same time, her identity, her rite of passage, her whole coming of age, the separation she's had from her mother, from her family life, has all fed into who she is now. And who she is now is not anything feels like she can, it doesn't feel like she can go back, I think. That's sort of my interpretation, but I don't know.
Yeah, no, and that's fascinating, because that's a little bit different from the way I first approached the story. Let me just bring up this comment here. At an institutional level, it also literizes the notion of post-secondary schooling, teaching people how to think, which is spot on. The way that I first approached the book was looking at it through a coming of age story, in a way of like becoming an adult and being fearful of becoming an adult and the unknown of that. So not only are you going through puberty and your body is literally physically changing, just as their bodies are physically changing in the book, but psychologically and emotionally, you also see those transformations within Sasha. Whereas first she's very free, and she cries and she wants her mother, and then at the end she's a little bit more detached and she doesn't cry as much, she doesn't fear as much. But it also came with this realization that of one, learning like, hey, I do have some level of free will. My choices do matter. And there's consequences to my choices, right? Just like we make that jump or that leap from when we're kids to being adults. Like our choices as kids are in a way encapsulated by our parents, because they only have a degree of consequence because we're often shielded by our parents, right? But as an adult, your choices are your own and the consequences are your own. Your parents don't really intervene in that anymore. And that's sort of the leap she had to take as well, that her choices could cause harm. If she didn't study hard enough, one of her family members could die or suffer a really big accident. So you go into that, I do have free will and I do have a choice, only to realize that you're still at the mercy of something greater, something that's unknown to you, some other force. So I took it as a coming of age, coming into adulthood type of story, and with a lot of philosophical and metaphysical and other elements thrown into that story. So I don't know if you saw it that way too.
I read it that way too, but at the same time, I read it and I kind of read it as a critique of culture in coming of age, because, well, I read it in the way that I think Fraser is saying in the comments, like that basically it's like a critique of academia, obviously telling you how to think. I could definitely see that. Just want to say that. But I also think she is going through this major change. She's trying to go through what I would consider maybe a rite of passage. And although, like you said, part of that entering adulthood is sort of letting go of your parental figure in that way, or that relationship in that way. I think, like, when I was reading this, I was thinking even though the relationship between her and her mother does need to change as she's becoming an adult, she still needs her mother. She still needs support. And her mother was just so absent. She felt so neglectful. And she did try to compensate for it later on, but it felt like a little too late. And maybe part of it was that her growing up in a single parent household, not having a father, maybe her mother just felt like she was putting, her mother was still quite young when she had her, is the impression I got at the beginning of the book. And so it's like her mother kind of didn't have a romantic life, she missed out on her own young adult experience. Her mother did. Her mother never got to have that sort of partying life, partying, kind of like young adult, fun life experience. And so maybe her mother was trying to compensate for not having something previously. And as a result, she goes to, man, I have forgotten his name. I had it written down. Sorry. The person that she ends up dating, basically, and ends up marrying. She
Yeah.
ends up kind of neglecting Sasha for this man. And I felt for Sasha. I felt like she's very alone in this situation. She still needs her mom, even though it maybe needs to be a little bit different than like an 8-year-old needs their mom. And so I kind of felt like that whole, maybe it's a critique of that whole entire area of life needing to be addressed in culture, as well as, of course, academic settings as well. And so, in that dynamic, because there are a lot of really like ugly power dynamics happening in that institution.
Sorry if you hear my dog in the background.
No.
I 100% agree with that. I was really, really upset at the beginning of the book when Sasha brought it up to her mom, like, hey, there's this man that's following me around and I'm scared. I don't even want to go get the groceries. She's like, oh, it's fine. People are on vacation. And she goes up to, who was it? It was Farit, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And she's like, oh, he's just on vacation and he can't be in the sun, like not taking her concerns as valid. That just really angered me. And especially when she was being coerced to go to the school. It was an interesting dynamic because you can see her mom, and she explains a little bit more at the end of the book, where she's like, I wanted to give you more reign of your own life. But she also wanted to implement her own rules onto her daughter, like, no, you should go to this university, you shouldn't go there. What will happen to your future? No one knows of this school. It's in a very small provincial town. But then also not stepping in enough to say, hey, is this really what you want? And looking past that mask per se. So yeah, she really angered me for most of the book.
Yeah, and actually all those things that you just mentioned, that made me so angry too. I was like, wow, you're going to totally screw up your daughter's perception of boundaries, obviously. And because of all those things that happened, I could not I was impressed with these authors so much, because the scenes where Sasha basically rejects the marriage proposals and doesn't commit, the way she becomes very avoidant in relationships and is even uncomfortable with I don't know, with intimacy in general. I was like, yeah, of course she's uncomfortable with intimacy, and of course she doesn't want to commit to a marriage contract, because it's the whole contractual, the whole responsibility behind the contract. And she's never been able to do what she wants to do. She's, we talked about agency, and maybe she does. There's kind of, it is curious whether she has agency towards the end of the book. It seems like she might, but she doesn't seem to for most of her life. So of course, to me, I'm like, of course she's going to be avoidant of any sort of committal relationship or feel uncomfortable with intimacy. And I felt like, by the way, that paralleled the concept when they were telling her, your problem is that you have too much willpower. When they said it in that context, I thought they meant you're too boundaried. And I'm like, well, she's too boundaried because she has so little of herself that she feels like she can hold on to as her own, because she's never been able to have any agency. But then eventually that lets go, and she goes through these very weird transformations.
Oh, I can't. Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought you were still talking for some reason. My screen like lagged out, and your lips were moving, and I thought I couldn't hear you. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. That's weird. I hope
Yeah.
my connection is okay.
No, it is. I think it was mine. But yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. There's a comment that I wanted to bring up. It says, yeah, I wonder if because she was neglected, she was targeted in the first place, their vulnerability being that the thing that will allow them to change, but in a way that's harmful at the systemic level. And so that actually brings up a question that I had. Why do you think these students are selected? And I hope we are pronouncing your name correctly, Fraser.
I know, I hope so too. Yeah, absolutely. No, I 100% think that's the case, because there was some talk about that with some of the other students too, feeling kind of neglected. And it's like and even with her roommate, the girl who, was coerced into sex, like that whole thing, like that's kind of grooming 101, right? And that's sort of how cults work. And that's how all these things work, is just to sort of intervene. And I think those would be targets. I would think so too. Yeah. That makes
break
sense.
you down to pull you back together, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think a little bit, not necessarily as part of the book, but keeping the book in mind, I guess, do you think in general people who are neglected or have experienced more trauma per se are more susceptible, more impressionable than people who maybe have a full support system, who are happier, who are able to enjoy more of that childhood and not think about their fear or be surrounded by fear? Because maybe in a way it's also critiquing that, or maybe alluding to that. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely not an expert on that topic, on that psychology, but I do sense that that's the case. I've seen that sort of play out even in some other books that I've read, that same kind of scenario, that of like sort of knowing how to isolate the victim or manipulate them in order to create that sort of separation from their parents. And and I think, like I said, I really do think there was a part in the book that kind of made me aware that there were other people at the school who also had very similar kind of relationships with their parents. So it did seem like that was kind of a problem, almost like a social commentary that the authors were highlighting. I did feel that way. But Valentine, I could not think of his name, Valentine, in the baby situations.
That's a good point that you make, Elena, though, because I do remember that by having the families be happier, finding their own success, they worry less about their children because they're involved in their own matters.
Yeah.
And then I think he edited their lives as a way to compromise her, as he seemed to do with most of their pupils of his, but not every mentor did that. That's true. I guess maybe some people needed more encouragement than others, or I wonder if it's also because of her status as, well, a verb at first, but then the past word later, whereas other kids weren't at that status or at that level. They could afford to lose a few kids here and there, but her level of importance was just highlighted a little bit more. I wonder if that had to do with it too.
That's true, because it was, yeah.
Another question for you that I had, what do you think are the meaning of the gold coins?
It's unspoken words. That was kind of given away at it was given away right after I think it was Kostya and her were he was trying to initiate sex or something. And then she bent over and threw up. And then there's like, it's actually highlighted. I highlighted there in the text something about how they were unsaid words. And then later on, that's brought up again. So that was weird. I was like, oh, wow. So again, it's sort of speaking to that whole silence, that victims are victims when they're silenced, right? So that's kind of speaks to the coercion at the beginning too, how she can't talk to her mom.
I think I might have missed that, because at first I was thinking, and maybe I read it, but I had a separate thought already and I clung to my own thought, but I thought it was the weight or the price of your actions. Because after swimming and going to the buoy, she threw up coins, then after running and after conducting all of these tasks, choosing to conduct that task, then that was the weight or the price of her actions. And that's ultimately what got her into the school. So I think I just clung to that thought so much, I might have missed the part where it was silence. Now I want to reread it all over again.
Well, that could be a better interpretation. I don't know. That's actually a really good interpretation too. I can look it up too. I have it highlighted.
Okay.
And
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say unspoken words.
Elena did bring up a good point that Fari was transforming into other mentors or their
That's right. Yeah, I forgot about that.
And the other people mentioned whoever else didn't seem to operate the same way Fari did. That's true. Until that part in the alley where I think she saw Dennis and his advisor, and that's when she realized it was Farid, and he didn't deny that that was him. It made me feel like if I knew more Russian.
I found that part, by the way. So it says here, let's see. Okay, so it's when she's with her mother. This is on page 164. Sasha could hear the sound of water. Valentine was in the shower. Sasha nodded, her lips squeezed tightly together. She went back to her room and closed the door. She fell on her knees and threw up. And then it says, unspoken words rolled around the room, gold coins smeared in slime. So that was early on in page 167. And then later on, there is a part where it says, did it mean that all unspoken words had not yet been turned into gold? Did it mean Sasha still had a chance? So that was another part where she was getting nauseous.
I totally missed that. And that adds like another layer of context for me.
And then later on, it says here, this is at the very, like the last 20 pages area. Let's see. I think I have to go back one page for context. I'm trying to remember where this part is. It says, all of them are words, Kostya said behind Sasha's back. All people have been manifested out loud some time ago, and they continue saying words, having no idea about their true meaning. Sasha thought that Kostya repeated almost identically what Farid had talked about before, but she did not say anything. Somewhere in the depths of hypertext, her unspoken words turned into gold coins with a round symbol on their faces.
Okay. Thank you for bringing that up. I totally missed that. And now, like I said, I'm excited to reread it and see what other things stand out that didn't the first time around. I also wanted to bring this up too, that Fraser mentioned about Russian literature and philosophy and it being a cultural thing or like a Russian folkloric thing. I was on Reddit and I think it's the authors, but they created a subreddit where they answered questions and somebody asked if this was based on Russian folklore or anything like that. And they said that it wasn't Russian, influenced by Russian folklore. It also said that they first came up with this idea when they watched a play called The Lesson, which is sort of an absurdist type of play by French-Romanian playwright Eugene Ionesco. So I just thought that was super interesting because I do see a lot of absurdism. Am I saying that right? Absurdism?
Absurdism.
Yeah. In the book, and I mean a lot of nihilism and existentialism too.
Can you explain that? Because I know a lot of people have been saying that they thought this was very existentialist. And I am aware what existentialist means, but I'm just curious how that's being interpreted I'm just curious, how do you interpret this as existentialist personally?
Yeah, and I actually read that too. And I honestly didn't really have any idea what existentialism and nihilism really were before looking them up. I know there are a lot of philosophical terms, and I didn't really know. I actually wanted to ask you too about the Plato cave analogy that you brought up. I wrote it down because I didn't know what that was in reference to, or what it is actually. But just, I guess, the back to that coming of age arc where figuring out that you as an individual do have choice or have agency, and you're able to make an impact on your life and your trajectory and your adulthood, versus you not meaning or being so minuscule in the universe that no matter what choice you make, ultimately you're predestined, right? Or you're selected, like these kids were in this book. They were going to become this thing, this word, or they were going to reverberate. And it just mattered how hard they work and how hard they wanted it, but they were still coerced into that trajectory. So I found that fascinating, and I can't dive a lot more into it because I still don't quite fully understand existentialism and nihilism, if I'm being completely honest.
Yeah. So this is my understanding, and I'm not an expert, but my understanding of existentialism is that like it's sort of a philosophy. So where you believe that there's this life, and that is it. You live, and then you die, and there is no afterlife. There is no external meaning assigned to your life. It's just life. So whereas a lot of other kinds of religions and things like that say we are here because God sent his only son, or we're here because there is a God and there will be an afterlife, and we're here to learn, we're here to grow, our life has this meaning because there's this divine force that has granted that or something. Existentialism is like, there is nothing. It's just you're here and then you die. Nihilism, and this is the way it was taught to me, and I haven't done, I know that like Camus' A Stranger apparently goes into this and everything, but nihilism is this idea where it's a darker form of that. It is very deterministic and, well, not, I don't know if deterministic's the right word, but it's basically the same idea. Like you live, you die, there is no meaning, but it's like a sort of darker version of that where it's like, well, then the so what is then it doesn't matter. Nothing I do matters.
I see.
And I don't have to care about anything because it's all for nothing anyway. That's a nihilistic view. And the existentialist, and I've heard this explained in that the nihilistic view can be like a stepping stone into, it could be kind of like a sort of phase you go through to become an existentialist, because you go through a phase where you're like, you get angry. You might feel kind of defeated if you did believe that there was a greater meaning. And then suddenly you realize that there is no meaning. There could be like a sort of frustration or upset with that, and a sort of nihilistic, it doesn't matter, then I don't have to do anything because it doesn't matter. Whereas the existentialism is more positive. It's like, that's true. There is nothing after this life. When I die, but I can make my own meaning. And so there's a sense of agency that suddenly comes alive in existentialism. Yeah. And I can make up my own meaning. I can create purpose for myself. I can make this moment count for something because I know it won't be here tomorrow. And so it's sort of coming from within rather than the meaning coming outside in. And anybody in the comments, you're welcome to correct me. Yeah. Not an expert.
And ultimately, isn't that what Sasha's doing as well, creating meaning from within? Right? In a way, I can see that in a way. Where she takes an agency and she decides to go not against, but study more, learn more, be more curious, and know that she knows within herself that she can't continue with the text and continue with the CD and the tracks, even though they tell her, hey, no, your body isn't ready. She's like, no, I'm ready. And she continues to do so, and she carves her own meaning and what she wants out of this, right? I feel like there's a way, there's room for that.
I think there is, yeah. I think that the beauty of the ending is that it is left a little open in that way, that you can interpret it that way, that there can be a sort of freedom. It does feel as though Sasha achieves a sense of freedom at the end.
I agree.
He's buried as an embodiment of the critique on how institutions operate, teaching them by removing agency and forcing them to learn. Okay. Oh, he's asking a question.
Yes, I would say yes. I can definitely see that in that. And I mean, it's talked about right from the beginning of the book, right? That all learning is coercion, even the learning of culture is coercion, because when you're a baby and you're being taught to speak a language, they're just random words and that have no meaning until you learn the meaning of them, right? And I mean, it actually really struck a chord when there was one quote that said that all we want to do is have fun, and like essentially not study, and we're forced to do that through institutions, and without that we wouldn't seek to learn or seek knowledge by ourselves. And I had to really think about that, because there's a version of me that thinks that without institutional learning I would seek knowledge for myself, like want to learn more. And I had to think to myself, like, is that the version of me that is now, or is that the version of me that I wish I could be, like just wanting to learn? And I wanted to say that it's not true, because I'm not in school anymore and I'm reading books, and I love to read books for me to teach, not just for escapism. I love books that teach me things. But then I had to come back and realize I started reading books because I went to school, and would I have even started if it wasn't for school? So I don't know.
That's cool.
Yeah. And by extension, the distillation of that as an emotion, something like fear, I thought. So an embodiment or a distillation of fear.
Agent number moving agency, I'm sure.
Yeah, I feel like she circumnavigates the path set out for her by Farid, which is why he didn't want her to realize her full potential and was like helping her but hampering her as well. Yeah. Yeah, not setting on the trajectory that was set for her and taking her own agency. I can see that.
There's a really cool quote I highlighted at the end.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to remember who was talking here. Let me see if I can find it. It's a conversation she's having with Farid, and he says, she asks him, like, why? Why through fear? Why not? Why wouldn't you explain things? I would study. I would work hard if you were nice to me. I think, did we talk about that part?
I did bring it up earlier, but I don't
Yeah.
remember the context.
Yeah. So that's the conversation I think you were mentioning earlier. And he shook his head. Yeah, I think this is the part you were talking about then. Yeah, I highlighted it because I loved it. He says, you wouldn't have, Sasha. Only a strong incentive takes you over the edge, only motivation. But there are other stimuli, love, ambition. There are none equal to fear, he said, almost with regret. It is the consequence of objective, unyielding laws. To live is to be vulnerable. To love is to fear. And the one who is not afraid, that person is calm, like a boa constrictor, and cannot love. He held her shoulders. Well, have you decided? So it's basically what you were just saying. The motivation, well, he's arguing that the only motivator, like you have to have fear as a motivator. And you're saying that, well, I don't know, is that true? Because I've, been reading books on my own, and
But where did that come from? So it's definitely a question that I'll be thinking about a lot more. But as you were reading that, I remember another passage where Farid brings up that Sasha loves, why am I forgetting his name now? Kostya? And she's like, no, I don't love him. And then he says that, I guess, sex isn't loving someone is fearing for them. And that just brings it all the way back to fear. Fear is to love, and the fear of losing someone is to love. And I've never thought of love that way, at least not with fear attached to it. So it's really interesting. It's just making me think.
I don't know. It makes sense to me though. Yeah. Yeah. Because as soon as you love something, then there can be the fear of losing it or something bad happening to it, or yeah. That's
Yeah,
true. There's a vulnerability to it. And with vulnerability, there has to be fear attached to vulnerability. Otherwise, it wouldn't be vulnerability. And then there wouldn't be courage without vulnerability. So they're all kind of inseparable in a way. So I kind of see what they're talking about.
definitely.
So then again, I like that because I know, never mind. Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no, tell me.
I was just thinking about the first time I love the book Dune by Frank Herbert.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite books of all time. But the first time I read that book, like a little over 10 years ago, I remember thinking, like, okay, fearlessness, you're not, fear is the mind killer. Everything is, it's wrong to have fear. And I was like trying so hard at the time to like get rid of fear and not be afraid. And then I realized, like, I don't know, at a certain point, I realized, oh, fear and love are interconnected and you can't really separate them. And it just suddenly clicked. And then I was like, of course, that's not, fear is not the ultimate enemy. I mean, I could see how some people see it that way, but I don't think it is.
Yeah, and it's also a mechanism for change, right? Without fear, we wouldn't grow because we have to have that motivation to overcome the fear.
Yeah. And I think I've heard before too that the opposite of love isn't fear. I think I read that in a book recently about how it's more like apathy or something like that. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Did you not want to bring up Dune because you know I didn't love it?
That was part of it. And then another part of it is like, I'm just going to do, I just hope I have to be careful about not digressing too much. So, yeah.
Dune is one I do want to reread just as a side comment. The first time I read it, I didn't like or Frank Herbert's writing style really didn't resonate with me at all. So the entire time I was extremely focused on the writing style and how much I hated it that I couldn't focus on the plot and the characters and the themes. So now that I am aware of the writing style and I can overlook it, I wonder if I'll have different thoughts. So we'll see. I will eventually reread it. I just don't know when.
Yeah, that's understandable.
There's another comment. I believe that fate exists as a connection, as a motivator for the kids, fear in this case, and when the students don't need him anymore, like Sasha in the end, he ceases to exist.
Oh, that's amazing. I love that. I actually love that. Because, yeah, I mean, that's how he controls her, it's through her fear.
And maybe that's why he wanted to give her an out, because maybe he would cease to exist if she stayed. That's so interesting. I didn't think of that.
It kind of makes me think of, like, in childhood, it's the monster under the bed or in the closet that seems so real, but like when you open the door, or if you or in a dream, if you're chased by a monster, they say just turn and look at the monster and it disappears or it changes. For most people anyway, I don't know if that's true universally, I think it is. But it's almost like he's like that monster that projects so much fear or elicits so much fear from her, and eventually he could cease to exist. That's interesting.
Yeah, eventually you don't need that monster, or you realize they're not as big of a threat as you thought they were.
But he's also, even though he represents fear or eliciting that emotion, he's also not a total villain either.
Yeah, he goes out, right?
Yeah, and I like that. I like that he's not like a villain, really. I mean, he has a human side to him, and he even gives her the choice at the end, and he does seem to care about her in his own way. I know it's probably twisted to say that, but I don't know if that might be kind of twisted. I'm not sure. Just considering what he has her do at the beginning, it's kind of gross.
Yeah, and even coming back to the term of a villain, right? Like, what is a villain other than an object or something that has opposing or conflicting views or actions from us, right? Because there's such a nuanced conversation with a villain, and I personally really like villains who are nuanced and where you can see their motivations, because at the end of the day, having a villain who is evil for evil's sake rather than tangible motivations that are driving them is, I don't know, it's boring to me. And for Reed, even though we never really actually get his motivations or his reasons for the role that he took or how he came into this role, but he doesn't always do evil things. And even Sasha at some point when she's talking with Kostya because his grandma died, she was like, well, he gave you a choice. You could have passed the first time around. And in a way, she began to understand Farid.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting too when you're mentioning, now that you're mentioning that, because for the funeral, she gets to meet Kostya's mother or see her, and it sort of humanizes Farid too. It's like, oh, this was your wife, and she just doesn't. She seems very, very human. So it's like almost imagining him having a more human life.
And now that you brought that up, I was a little bit confused, and I think he did mention it, but so he's not entirely human, but he did have Kostya. That was a little bit confusing to me. The whole he's like this embodiment of emotion, but he's also a living human, tangible thing that can reproduce. That was an interesting thing that I hadn't seen.
And yeah, it's sort of that interesting magical realism, not explained. You know what I mean? Like surreal magical realism thing.
Up for interpretation. What do you think about this question here? Do you think, one, do you think she passed the exam? And then two, does she create like a new, I guess, a new world or new plane based on Elena's question or comment? Or is she still living in the same plane or time, but now she's free and she's able to transform and no longer need the institution to sort of help her transform.
I definitely got the impression that she was outside the institution at that point, that she was no longer bound to the institution, was the impression I got. But I don't know. It was so wide open there. She definitely seemed to transform on a level that it's hard to say, because I mean, like, she was able to go into that to, see her mother and baby brother, but obviously not in her human form. Not sure.
Yeah. I like this comment here. I thought she became a concept like Farid, so both able to take form like Farid, but also this macro perspective. So right when I finished the book, I thought she died, and I didn't really have a, I guess like a direction where I thought she became a concept, or if she was just free, like boundless, just existing, or if she can transform and transmute. And then I reread it again, and what I'm thinking is that she died in her human form, and now she's able to exist and take any shape that she wants, or like Farid said, more of a concept. It's still unclear, but I definitely think she lost the part of herself, or she died in some sort of way. Like if not her human body, like some part of her died. That's just my interpretation of it. How do you feel about that?
I just don't know. I'm looking at the last pages right now, you will create, reverberate. Well, it says here the word at the end, she failed, she did not pass, failing grade. The empty dark space around Sasha was lit up. Multitude of stars, and stars turned into gold coins. It's just wild. I refuse to be afraid. And at that moment, she reverberated and she knew what she heard.
The line that stuck out to me was when she says, "It's me, Sasha," and then it's like, "I haven't completely come back yet. I am in your dream."
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That was just so interesting to me.
I've always loved you. Let's see. I haven't completely come back yet. I am in your dream. One important secret. I love you. I've always loved you. in the beginning. I like that darkness. In the beginning was the word. That sounds almost like biblical to me. There was so much about there was so much about words too that were some interesting passages towards the end too about the power of words that she's having like these powerful reflections about the power of what words they say and what they do, but also the power of unsaid words. So it just seems like going back and forth, she feels both grateful to them and sad for them. There's like sadness and gratitude, so many conflicting emotions about words said and unsaid. And I was like thinking, this is interesting. It's like I don't how to take all that. It's like I just felt like there's a lot to reflect on just the power of what we say and what we can't take back.
I agree. And related to words, one thing that we haven't talked about is the name of the book, Vita Nostra, which I think means our life. How do you think? Do you think it's an appropriate title for the book? And like, here I am trying to find meaning into things. But do you think it was intentional with the way that the plot in the book progresses, or what do you think the title is trying to like encapsulate, I guess?
I'm trying to remember exactly. I'm sorry, what is it? The title means
Our life. It comes from a song called the Gaudeamus Igitur.
right.
And I think translated into English, the entire part goes, "Our life is brief, soon it will end. Death comes quickly, snatches us cruelly, to nobody shall it be spared."
Yeah.
Just kind of grim, very dark.
I'm honestly, I haven't quite made the connection yet between that song, the translation of that song, and what's happening at the Institute. Except that it does seem as though they're there and then they're gone and they don't really know what happens to them after that third year. And I guess it seems to be like a passage of life and death at the institution. That's sort of, but then you learn that they're words. And so I guess I'm trying to make the connection between that with the words part is kind of a harder one for me to make a connection between. I could see, like I said, the Vita Nostra, I could see how the Institute itself is sort of maybe a passage of death in a way.
Yeah, and I think this is where I first made or in my mind, I associated Fareed with death because of death comes quickly, snatches us cruelly, and in a way, that's what he did with the kids. He came, took
Yeah.
them away, and then to nobody shall it be spared, and none of them are spared. So I think that's where I associated him with death for some reason. But I just thought that was so interesting. And I wonder why the authors chose this title. Just because it's so unique, like Vita Nostra. I don't know.
Oh, wow. That's such a cool interpretation. I bet you're right about that.
One day I hope to ask them. They live in the United States now. I think they live in California.
That's what I heard. Yeah, that's what I read. Or it says that in the back. They were born in Ukraine, and then they lived some time in Russia, and then now they live in the U.S.
Yeah. Well, that is exciting because hopefully the rest of the series gets translated very soon. I'm really excited to keep reading. Elena said, "She definitely became a higher entity in my opinion, and I wonder how much she can bend the reality now and for how much time in advance, how big she can make a loop. It drives me mad that we don't have more books." Yes, I agree.
The time loop thing was so fascinating, by the way, because I love, obviously, time travel. It's a thing for me. It's a buzzword for me. But this whole time concept was also wild in this book. Fascinating. And especially that part where she kept repeating the same day over and over again. Oh, my heart broke for her.
And I didn't realize that that's what was happening at the beginning of the book. It had this very like, I don't even know how to describe it. It just because right at the beginning of the book, she was reliving the same day, right, when she kept avoiding Fareed. Is that what was happening? That was my interpretation of it. But it felt very surreal reading it. It felt like something was wrong, but I couldn't really quite pinpoint it. And then later, when she gets put in the loop, I was like, oh, that's what was happening, because I hadn't caught that until then.
You know, I didn't think about that until this, like right before the slideshow. I finally was like, oh yeah, because it happens at the beginning of the book. And then it happened, I don't know why, I just didn't even make the connection until like later. I found this other quote. This is on page 292. It says, there are concepts that cannot be imagined, but can be named. Having received a name, they change, flow into a different entity, and cease to correspond to the name. And then they can be given another name, given another different name. And in this process, the spellbinding process of creation is infinite. This is the word that names it. And this is the word that signifies a concept as an organism and text as the universe. The fourth dimension sewn into the diagram wholly eliminates the concept of time. The result was word, and word was the original cause of any process. That is a headache word.
Yes. Really mind-bending. And I love the references to Shakespeare that were included in the whole, naming, and does a name change the object or its meaning, or is it still the same object with a different name? The entire thing was just fascinating.
Yeah, I think that that quote kind of reminds me of that idea. There are concepts that cannot be imagined but can be named. It's so bizarre.
Oh, to choose, but I hope it's all in. Oh, I see. It looks like they're translated already. It's just up to the publisher to choose to publish them.
Oh, huh.
Okay. We always have to sing that song at the end of high school, college. Is it common everywhere? It's super grand for graduation song. Are you talking about the one that goes like, so we talked all day about the rest of our lives, what it's going to be when we turn 25? I keep thinking times will never change. Something like that. I don't remember the name of the song, but it is a very popular graduation song. I don't know if it's the same one.
Oh, yeah. I don't think I ever knew that. I don't know that song.
One of the authors was a teacher too.
Many do. Many do. I think that comes along with being a teacher.
It made me think that the whole book might be an allegory for the actual process of writing a novel and creating fiction itself, which then became the magic system. Wow.
I actually thought that at one point. I was wondering the same thing. I remember having that distinct passing thought. I'm like, is this like allegorical for writing a story?
That's fascinating. I didn't think about it in that context either.
Yeah.
I just thought that the magic, can we call it a magic system, or more of, so what is it, more magic or is it more sci-fi?
I have no idea. All I know is that I did think about the allegorical part too, especially with her imperative. That's the word I was looking for earlier. She's a verb in the imperative mood, and then I think, is it Igor was the Yegor was the verb in the subjunctive mood, and the subjunctive mood is more like impressionable, is the impression I got. And so she had to kind of work with that in order to help him pass. And so I was like, this is so interesting because he's a side character too. And that felt like kind of, I don't know, he complimented her as sort of a love interest side character. And I'm like, this sort of kind of goes along with narrative devices, this idea that they are these sort of like terms or these sort of words and these ideas. And then another thing that I really liked, and I got all like into this whole concept, and this is totally going off another tangent and deep end, so I hope that'll be okay for me to share this.
Totally.
Thank you. It's the idea that, like, I love the idea that she's a verb, at least that part. I know later on we find out she's a password, which is probably cooler. But I like the idea that she was a verb too, because a verb is an action word. And a lot of times we think of identity as a noun. This is what I am. And nouns are very static. Yeah. Whereas verbs are not static. They're always kind of moving and they're always in action. And she's constantly metamorphosizing and changing and growing wings and breaking out of her shell. And
Yeah.
sort of, and I just thought that was really, really interesting how that worked.
That is extremely insightful and something that I'm going to take away from this discussion. Wow, we think of identity as a noun,
Yeah.
but she's a verb. And so, wow, okay, that was mind blowing to me. Thank
Isn't that cool? I love it. Well, I learned about that through somebody who was talking about how we think of ego that way. We think of ego as the
Yeah.
person's ego is a noun. But really, when you're in a state of like ego, sort of, you're constantly, it's a verb. Like those, it's a process of psychology. So I don't know. It made sense to me. So I kind of like it. But anyway, if you just take it at the verb state and even just the roles of the, I don't know, it's interesting because like I know this is a critique of institutions, but it could also be a critique of storytelling, of writing, and the rule, the grammatical rule, So it's like a lot of writers might think, oh, you're not allowed to write stories like this. Things have to go this way. But the grammatical rule can be bent or sort of subverted, maybe. So I just wonder about that too. I think there could be a lot of interesting sort of allegorical interpretations of this story.
Definitely. And I think that's one of the things that I appreciated most about the novel is that it deviated from the Western format, right? And it works. And getting back to just like translated fiction in general, like it's just so fun, but also insightful and illuminating to read from a different world perspective. And this just shows that, I don't know, the love for translated literature, like you just find so much more, even if we as readers try to find our own meaning in it, different from what the authors try to say or what their intention was. It's just so different from other books that I've read within the fantasy genre. It's unique in its own way.
Yeah, I agree.
I think this was for the graduation song. I didn't realize it was a graduation song. That's so interesting.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
This is my brother. Hi, Brandon. Thank you for coming.
Oh, oh, that's so nice.
Totally, I think it's operating at both levels. I know we've been talking for quite a while and it's been such a great and interesting discussion. I just wanted to make sure that before we end, was there anything else that you wanted to talk about, or even just what was your favorite part of the book? Just anything else you wanted to mention?
Oh, what was my favorite part of the book? Because I did have a bunch of like highlights and stuff, but I don't know. I don't know if I had a very specific favorite part of the book. I can just say that I just really enjoyed the ride, the journey that this character went on. And, we talked a bit about the psychology of the character. I think that was my favorite part, was just following her psychological journey and watching her mind change. And I was just feeling it. Like I just was sort of inside and outside of the experience of this book at the same time, where I was like,
Yeah.
oh, wow, I could see her shifting. I could see her shifting. I could see her changing. And just seeing the way that the authors were able to do that, because it made sense for me. Her character, I think I mentioned this to you in our previous discussion on my channel about how I felt like every choice she makes sense. Like I felt like I followed the logic of her motivations and why she was doing every single thing she was doing, and then at the same time watching her transform. And so for me, it was just a very well written, very well realized story, incredible character work from that perspective, and just a very creative concept, and the atmosphere too. I loved the atmosphere. We already kind of talked about that, but just the whole academic atmosphere, the juxtaposition of like the mundane elements we talked about with the sort of mysterious intrigue and suspense and like low-key suspense and surreal elements too. So yeah, did you have a particular favorite part?
I was going to mention that the atmosphere was my favorite, and just the incorporation of all of these different elements, philosophy, metaphysics, with like fantastical and sci-fi elements. And even horror, like the transforming, was a little bit of body horror included in there too. And they just worked so well. I think other books try to do this, but it doesn't feel like a cohesive piece of work, whereas this did. And I just love that. I'm actually, I think we talked about this too, where I think I told you I read Catherine House, and I was really nervous going into Vita Nostra because I know it does have elements of dark academia, and Catherine House really did not work for me. And in this one, it's a similar situation. We're following one individual student, and even though we're not necessarily in her mind, we're really just following her every day-to-day things. But this one just tonally worked for me, and the way that those elements were incorporated also worked for me. But I did want to come back to something you said earlier that I forgot about until I looked at my notes. You said that you were the ending. You said that you were a little bit detached. What was that?
Yeah, I am still trying to figure that out. I think it's because I felt so invested in Sasha throughout this whole journey and just with her. And then suddenly, when it's like, oh, you're a password, for some reason, I thought it was brilliant. And I thought, oh, that makes sense. That all is really cool. And that's a really cool concept. But it was like, it went into my head at that point. I was like, cool concept. Sasha's a cool concept. And suddenly the human part of Sasha transcended into concept. And I feel like that's what the authors were trying to do. And they did it. They succeeded. And they did it brilliantly. But from an emotional perspective, I think it took me really up here. And I think I was hoping, I don't know why, I don't know what I was expecting or if I could expect anything. I just know I just felt like, okay, that was a cool concept. I liked it a lot. But I don't know why it didn't quite, and this is very subjective, so I'm sorry, because I know this is a lot of people's favorite book. But I guess I always want books to, like Piranesi, for example, that book, I did feel towards the end, I was like, oh, is this getting a little like cerebral, like a little heady for me, or too conceptual or something? Because I like that, but that like is always, but then the thing is, I like the balance between here and here. And for me with Piranesi, it brought me back here so hard. I cried. I know that's not a book everybody cries over, but I cried. And I did cry. Okay, cool. Yeah. I got emotional over it. I was like, oh my goodness. It brought into, it connected it back to sort of like a human theme. And this has like big, broader, conceptual, universal themes, but I wasn't quite, at the end, it didn't quite ground me back down into the human takeaway kind of place. So that was where the detachment happened. I say detached whenever I'm describing an experience that's really cool, but I was hoping to, I guess, to have more of an emotional response to what happened to her. And I felt like it should have been. That was the other problem too, is her coming and saying that she loved her mother and she always loved her. To me, I felt like, okay, that was supposed to be emotional, but I didn't feel anything. So then I felt confused because I was like, I've been loving this book. Like really, I thought this was going to be like my favorite book of the year. And then I got to the end and I was like, I guess I don't know. I think I overhyped myself throughout the book for something to hit me a little harder. But at the same time, as I say all that, like I said, I think the ending made sense. I think it was so well done, so perfectly conceived. And I love that we can talk about it for hours and just come up with so many ideas of what's happening.
Yeah, and I appreciate your candid thoughts because I feel like this is a book that is meant to be discussed, right? And the ending isn't going to work out for everybody. Even the book, like its entirety, isn't going to work out for everybody because it is very conceptual. And that's also why I couldn't give it 5 stars either. It sits at like a 4-star for me because it was so conceptual that, like you said, it doesn't ground you to the emotions and to the characters all the times. So yeah, I feel that. Did you have any theories, by the way? This was a question that popped up leading up to what was happening. Because so I heard people compare it to Harry Potter and Metamorphosis. So going into it, I was like, oh, okay, there's gonna be some maybe body horror, some transformation of some sort. And what I thought was going to happen is that she was either going to transform and break free and like cause chaos or something like that, like something like akin to Frankenstein, where she's misunderstood and people think she's a monster now. So that was one sort of theory I had. And the other was going to be that she didn't fully transform, that something went wrong, and now she is like running from her life from the Institute of Special Technologies and she's on the run. So I guess I was very much in like a thriller mood because I feel like those are very thrillery endings. But I thought that's what was going to happen halfway through the book. And then as it started being more philosophical and metaphysical, I was like, oh no, I have no idea where this is going. And I'm not even going to try to guess.
Well, it's funny because I remember at one point thinking, before Farid gave her the option to wake up, I was like, oh no, she's going to wake up and this was all a dream and she's on vacation. I was like, no. So I remember thinking that's not going to happen, but that would be the obvious cop-out ending. But I knew that wasn't going to happen because I know people hate that kind of ending.
Yeah.
And people loved this book too much for that ending to be possible. So I knew that wasn't going to happen, but I did think like it could be a setup for that. And then I thought it was really funny when he gave her the choice, because I thought, well, because the whole time I kept wondering, I'm like, why is it that how come she could do that at the beginning of the book, and why couldn't she do that later on? And I'm still kind of confused why. Like, why didn't she have the choice later on to wake up out of it? And what? And the other thing, the other theory I had, and is that I wondered if she was a projection of Farid, if she was his projection the whole time, if it was his, like, and I think I already mentioned that I thought that maybe this is all happening in his mind. So some kind of weird mystery like that. But so yeah, I did have some weird theories, but none of them seemed to correspond with what happened.
Two very interesting questions. I'll need to think about those some more too. What I'm guessing is the reason she couldn't snap out of it at the beginning is because she hadn't gone through the process yet. And correct me if I'm wrong, but when she snapped out of the dream the first time, she hadn't yet thrown up the coins. It was, I think Farid was still like stalking her. And she's like, oh no, I want to wake up. And then she would end up, Farid wouldn't be there. But then after the first time she threw up the gold coins, I feel like that solidified her fate. Like she made the choice to embark on this journey. But I could,
it's still weird though, because she does confront her mother before all that and says there's this man, and like we said, and her mother confronts Farid, and it doesn't really help Sasha at all. And so it's like you can't really blame that on unspoken words at that point, but it's not effective. Her words weren't effective. They didn't help her. So it just, I don't know. It's mysterious. It's really interesting. We'll see. My favorite part is, will we be using language? And he says, no, language will be using you. Yeah, I don't know.
I agree. That resonated a lot. But because it was like a form means function. Yeah, I guess throughout the book there was this sort of underlying, I don't know if I want to say critique, but there was definitely some themes around attachment and love, and with her relationship with her mom and her leaving school. So I don't know what it's trying to say about attachment yet. I have to think a little bit more on it. I just finished this book this morning, but there's definitely some thing going on about some discussion of attachment, I think, in the book.
Avoidant. She's the avoidant attachment type.
Yes.
You know about attachment styles and stuff?
What are they?
It's basically this theory that how you're treated as a child is going to inform how you respond to relationships when you're older. So if you had a parent who was very neglectful, that might inform the way you act in relationships later on in life. Or if they're very clingy helicopter parents, that might affect the way you are. Or if they are trying to, they don't let you, they make you feel anxious by being fearful for you all the time. So there's ideas about that. Anyway, I'm sorry, I have to go soon, unfortunately. But we can go through the last few comments though.
It was a lovely discussion. I haven't read Kafka yet. Oh, sorry. No, I have. I read Metamorphosis. I thought Kafka on the Shore, and I was like, not the same thing.
Have you read that?
I haven't. I do need to read Murakami. I'm trying to prepare myself because I know there's a lot of sexism. Because Ben has read it. He read Kafka on the Shore and maybe Q184. I can't remember. But he was thrown off by it, and he's a man. So, yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much for everybody that joined. It's been such a fruitful discussion. I loved having you on my channel, Johanna, and I love discussing this book with you. Everything you said was so insightful, and I love that we each brought our own different perspectives. Any last minute thing you wanted to say before we go?
Oh, I just want to say thank you so much. This was awesome. I can't think of a better book choice too for us to have discussed, because there were so many layers to this book. I feel like I could easily reread it and just see totally different things. Thank you so much, Alicia, for having me. It's been such a pleasure, and thank you so much to those of you in the chat, because you all added so much to the discussion as well. Really appreciate it.
I agree. And just to close off, I will be putting out the video for the next 3 book selections for the Lit in Translation Book Club. In case you are interested, they'll be coming out, I would say, closer to May 1st. I still have to solidify 1 more book for July with my co-host, but that should be up soon. But thank you again, Johanna, for your presence and very engaging dialogue and discussion. But with that, we will end the broadcast. Thank y'all.
Thank you. Bye.